Fast Forward Productions. The women are speaking.
If we don't have being, we don't have anything. Being comes first. Even before all our purposes and our wants and our deeds, poetry is about the thrill of being. You know, a flower or a bird doesn't have to go do anything. It's a flower or a bird or whatever it is, a work of art, whatever, a piece of music. It is what it is. I think that's a beautiful, beautiful part of life.
You're listening to the Good Dirt Podcast. This is a place where we dig into the nitty-gritty of sustainable living through food, fashion, and lifestyle.
And we're your hosts, Mary and Emma Kingsley, the mother and daughter founder team of Lady Farmer. We're sowing seeds of slow living through our community platform, events, and online marketplace.
We started this podcast as a means to share the wealth of information and quality conversations that we're having in our world as we dream up and deliver ways for each of us to live into the new paradigm, one that is regenerative, balanced, and whole.
We want to put the microphone in front of the voices that need to be heard the most right now, the farmers, the dreamers, the designers, and the doers.
So come cultivate a better world with us. We're so glad you're here. Now, let's dig in.
Good morning, Emma.
Good morning.
I have a poem today to share.
I'm so excited.
Yes, this poem was shared with us by our guest for today, Baron Wormser, and we'll talk more about that later. But he sent it because during the interview, we had talked a lot about this topic. And so he shared this with us, and I thought it was worth sharing with our audience today. The title of the poem is Convenience, and it is written by W.S. Merwin, who is an American poet of this century. And here we go. Convenience. We were not made in its image, but from the beginning we believed in it, not for the pure appeasement of hunger, but for its availability. It could command our devotion beyond question and without our consent. And by whatever name we've called it, in its name, love has been set aside. Unmeasured time has been devoted to it. Forests have been erased and rivers poisoned, and truth has been relegated for it. Wars have been sanctified by it. We believe that we have a right to it, even though it belongs to no one. We carry a way back to it everywhere. We are sure that it is saving something. We consider it our personal savior. All we have to pay for it is ourselves. By W.S. Merwin.
Wow. All we have to pay for it is ourselves.
Yeah. And, the topic of convenience comes up a lot in our conversations on this podcast. And it is a very, very interesting thing to turn around and talk about and unpack and unpeel. And so thank you, Baron, for sharing this poem with us. And we'll loop back to Baron, our guest, in a moment. But I think you have something else to talk about before we get into the episode today.
I do. And I wanted to add to that poem, love the way that it frames convenience as a sacrifice, which I think is something that we don't often think about. What are we sacrificing when we put convenience on a pedestal?
Yes, I'm particularly struck by the line, we believe that we have a right to it. I think that's really something we're thinking about.
It's confusing because as humans, we're so good at solving problems and we love being efficient. And I think that problem solving and that sort of thing, that's so close to convenience.
Oh, it is. And I like to say that, humans are ingenious. We figure out ways to make things easier for ourselves. And so we come up with solutions. And then in many ways, the solutions become problems sometimes. So it's just, something to look at.
Definitely. So just to mention that this week, our membership pledge drive is launched, and we're so excited to invite all of you to join, to participate in whatever way you are able, in whatever capacity you're able. So we are looking for pledges, for monthly pledges to help keep the Good Dirt going, to help support the show. We have a couple of ways that we're able to do that, and it is through your generous contributions as a listener, and then also in working with brands through sponsorships. And if you're a listener, you'll know that we do that occasionally if the brand is a really good fit and if it's a brand that we would really trust and a product we would use, that also means that we're very picky. So we don't want to have to rely on that to keep the show going. So that's why we have decided to do a membership pledge drive to get you all excited about supporting the show and just be really open and honest about everything it takes to run the show and how your contributions mean everything to us. So you'll go to our website, you'll see there's a few different tiers, a few different levels at which you can pledge monetarily. And we have a ton of great rewards in there based on your pledge level. As you can see, it sort of cooperates with the way that our current online membership platform is set up. This specific membership pledge is designed for, you don't have to be a member, to participate, to do the things. This is just a pledge of your support for the show. So that is really exciting.
Yes, thank you. And it makes me think of, in relation to this poem and the idea of convenience and things we talk about on this show a lot, is just being thoughtful and intentional about things that we put our resources into and what we base our decisions on. And maybe an exercise to ask ourselves when we're thinking of purchasing things, are we making those decisions based on the idea of convenience or value to us or the world? So it's not anything to make you feel guilty. It's just a reminder to maybe think before we make our purchases, to be intentional and try to get beyond the surface maybe a little bit and understand how we're making these decisions. Are we making these decisions based on this cultural idea of convenience and that we have a right to it? Or are we making these decisions about our purchases and where we're going to allocate our resources based on value to us and value to the world? And it's just a suggestion for something to think about.
I love that. In other words, pledging to the Good Dirt podcast might seem really inconvenient, but it will add to your life in so many ways. And you will love it and feel great about it. I love that. Another that reminds me of actually an interview that we did this week that won't be out for a few weeks. Our guest said that a while ago she made the decision to not buy anything because it's on sale. And that's something that I'm going to be thinking about in the convenience realm. Just, you buy things when you need it. If it happens to be on sale, great. But I find myself falling into that trap, when things are on sale. Oh, I guess that means I need it if it's on sale. So I like that exercise too. So yeah, to bring it back to the drive, these pledges, it's not on sale. We're not running a sale. We are, however, sweetening the pot by offering some really fun Good Dirt pledge drive only rewards. So these things won't be available in the store. You can only get them by contributing to the podcast in this way. And if contributing monetarily is something that you are unable to do at the moment, there are so many other ways in which you can contribute and help us grow the show and spread the good dirt. So we appreciate that a lot. Without further ado, we are excited to transition this wonderful episode with Baron Wormser. Would you like to introduce our guest?
Yes, our guest today is Baron Wormser. He's an award-winning poet, professor, and author. We were introduced to Baron through his son, Owen Wormser, who you might remember from the Good Dirt episode 151, Lawns into Meadows. And during this interview, we talked a lot about his off-grid upbringing in rural Maine. Owen also told us that his father had written a memoir of the family's experience entitled The Road Washes Out in Spring, a poet's memoir of living off the grid. The book was originally published in 2005, but it was re-released earlier this year. And we were so taken with the story that we reached out to Baron to see if he would come on the show, and we're so grateful that he said yes.
Baron has been an example of slow and sustainable living throughout his life and career, and has brought his gift of storytelling to our conversation about such things as connecting poetry with how we live, the value of simple living, and how we connect with the earth. So thank you, Baron, for shining a light for all of us on these topics and for being with us today. So here is Baron Wormser, the author of The Road Washes Out in Spring.
My name is Baron Wormser. I'm a poet, writer. I lived out in Montpelier, Vermont. I'm here today to speak to a book I wrote about my experience and my family's experience of living off the grid in the Maine woods for over 23 years. That book is called The Road Washes Out. It's Spring, a poet's memoir of living off the grid.
Okay. And you kindly sent me your book a couple of months ago, and I've enjoyed reading it so much. The book itself is like a poem. It's very much a story of a way of life that not many people living on the planet know much about these days. So I would like to ask you, can you speak to some of the factors that went into your decision to do this, and what was sort of the timeline in your life? You and your wife were young. It was before you had kids, I believe. And so what informed this decision? Was there an aha moment that made you think we're going to do this?
Okay, well, generationally, we were part of what has been called the Back to the Land movement of 1960s and 1970s, in which largely urban, often educated people decided they had had enough of the urban experience and basically wanted to connect with the earth and the rural world. We were part of that. We had that. My wife and I both had that enthusiasm to go do that. That was about a lot of things. I think it was obviously about a hankering to connect in ways with the earth. It was also a hankering for a kind of authenticity, to be able to take care of ourselves in ways and to learn how to do that. We really had no idea whatsoever of what we were getting ourselves into. I don't know how many people did. I'm sure some did, but many did not. Consequently, many people left for understandable reasons. So we moved to the country. We were living in Maine, which was sort of just turned out that we were footloose and rented a house in Maine, and we liked it, like Maine, and decided we wanted to stay. I figured out a way to earn a living. I was a school librarian, and that's, of course, a huge issue if you want to live in a rural area, because it's not a big job market. So we had a grip on that. Then we bought land from an old Mainer who literally collected land sort of like postage stamps in the 1930s. He just had land all over the state of Maine. He had land he never even laid eyes on. He lived in a kind of rundown house in a little town in Maine. We just heard about him, someone talking about him. This wasn't advertised or anything. He needed some cash. We bought about 40 acres for, I think it was $3,500. It was on a discontinued road, which means the road washes out in spring, if you want to call it a road to begin with. But we were undeterred. We also didn't have much money, so the price was right. And it was a nice piece of land. It was on a dead-end road, which very much suited us. Beyond us was just miles and miles of woods. Nobody there. So that's sort of the background story of how we landed there. And then once we bought the land, we learned that the power company, Central Maine Power, wanted for us a sizable amount of money to run the poles in over a half mile. We could have done that. We were within a half mile. Part of our plot of land was within, but being the people we were, we preferred the house site at the very edge of the land at the top of a hill, which was an old house site of houses, farmhouse that sat there. In the 19th century, there was a cellar hole there. There was an elm tree, dead elm. And there was a dug well. And, we much preferred that site. So we decided, what the heck, we'll just do without power. And so we did.
Yeah.
For over 23 years without the power lines. So that's sort of the background of the story.
Did you think that, we can add the power later if it gets to be an issue, and it just never happened? Was it that kind of thing?
That's exactly right. We thought, we'll do this down the road, and become regular people, so to speak. But we got used to it. It didn't seem like an imposition. After we got used to it, it had a whole economy in the real sense of the word, not the economy like it's used in America now, but the economy in terms of the balances of living and paying attention to what you're doing and how you live. And it was pretty modest.
I was saying, tell us what that looked like logistically for you,
Yeah, there was no backup heat. It meant if you wanted to be warm, you had to make a fire. There was a cook stove, as they call it in Maine and other places, in the kitchen. And there was a little propane 4-burner stove in the kitchen. And there was then a larger stove that we used for heat. in the house. Eventually, we added on 2 bedrooms for our children. One of those bedrooms was Owen's, and we put a little stove in there. Heat was one thing you had to pay attention to if you wanted to be warm, and we were warm. It was a little modest-sized house. The bottom floor was 24 by 32, and then there was a sleeping loft. So it wasn't a big place. So there was that water. Water came from a dug well with a pitcher pump in the house. Eventually, because we experienced drought a couple years, and we had to haul water for months. And so we got together the money and we drilled a well, which had a pump on it too, a long-handled piston pump. You see them in state parks sometimes. They have these long handles and, you get water up. But that still meant hauling water. We use that to water our garden, bucket by bucket. So that kind of took care of water. Outhouse, so that took care of that. We had kerosene lights. Eventually we had a propane light. You have to fill the kerosene lamps and tend the wicks and pay attention to that. Food, we were pretty much vegetarian, so it wasn't a big deal. We hung a box from a trap door in the kitchen underneath the house. The house was built on piers, and that kept things reasonably cool. We weren't stockpiling a lot of, hamburger. So I worked every day. I worked at a job. So I went to the store once a week, a natural food store in a town nearby. Typically, our routine was do the laundry, buy food, do whatever errands that we needed to do in town. So this all became an economy. And then we had gardens and we canned a certain amount of food. We had a root cellar eventually. The children's addition was built over the root cellar. It was a great root cellar. It was very deep in the earth. So we kept potatoes, cabbages, carrots, all that sort of thing throughout the winter. This may be more detail than you're interested in. I don't know.
No, it's great. I'm wondering, what year did you move out there?
So we were there from, let's say, what was it, around 73 to 97. Let's see, 74 to 97. That would be it. 74. Because our daughter had been born. She was born in 73. As you know, if you've read the book, Owen was born in the house in 75. So, yeah.
Yes, that's a lovely story. And it's occurring to me that if this was the mid-70s, it was only like a half century or less since people in the backwoods, I imagine in Maine, and certainly I know in areas where I grew up in southern Appalachia, where people didn't have power, much before the mid-1930s. So, we talk about this lifestyle as something so foreign and outdated when really it was not that long after that's the way people used to live out in the country.
Yeah. Some of the old timers, they really got a kick out of us that way. Here we were becoming old timers ourselves, even though the times had changed. We had embraced that. Now, obviously, they thought we were a little cracked in ways to go do this. But, as I said, they kind of got a kick out of it. And of course, they knew a lot of things about how to live. Because you're right, that's how they had lived. Our neighbor, was born around the turn of the 20th century. So there was a whole kind of historical side to the whole thing. And I write about that in the book, all these cellar holes and people had lived here and the woods had grown up. And, our neighbor's father, that was the 19th century. When he was something like a boy, he might have seen Abraham Lincoln. So nothing seemed very long ago in a way, So you're right. Yes.
Yeah. And another thing that I noticed, especially reading through your book and your routines and the tasks, just to live day to day, things that to the outside world and to people living with all the modernization might think, oh, that's really hard. That's just so inconvenient, and all those things that we might think. You and your family just very quickly assimilated and normalized these things so that it wasn't like, oh, this is such a hardship. This is just your way of life. And as a poet, these are your observations, I think. As I'm reading the book, I sort of see how these are your observations, that these simple tasks that bring us light and help us heat up our food and help us keep warm are the poetry of your life there. And you make poetry of it, and because you're a poet, and you show other people now through your memoir, these things like not having a telephone. It was just normal for you. And it created an opportunity for you all to live life through the simple tasks and through the necessary things that sustained you. And I think that's what people are so attracted to these days. The idea of slow living, like doing things simply, bypassing conveniences in order to experience just these everyday things that are the simple life.
I agree. There's a great poem, maybe you know it, by W.S. Merwin called Convenience. Basically, we're destroying the earth in the name of convenience, basically. That's what's going on. And we think we're entitled to that convenience, and we don't think at whose expense that convenience comes from. So for all this connection we have, in fact, we're extremely disconnected. And obviously, as you're pointing out, Mary, if we don't have being, we don't have anything. Being comes first. Even before all our purposes and our wants and our needs, which obviously is part of our problem, we take all our wants and declare them to be needs. They're not. They're not. That's not true. That's not true. You may want to go to Europe 4 times this year. That's not a need. You may want 4 flat screen TVs in your house. That is not a need. But for many reasons, obviously, one is it's just promoted. We're in that place where that's how we look at life. And consequently, that, as you point out, Mary, that gives us a very strange sense of hardship. If you can't take a hot shower every morning, is that a hardship? I don't think so. I don't think so.
That's really interesting to think about what we define as need and hardship and what that really means and how we qualify that. And I wonder, in your personal experience living off the grid and in your full and vibrant life, what are some of the things that you at one point might have thought as, oh, that's a hardship and I could never do that. I could never handle that. That's too much. And then you realized that it wasn't a hardship and that you could deal with it. And then opposite, I guess, what's something that, we're speaking to you right now on a computer. So now that you don't live off grid, what's something that you really wouldn't want to go back to?
Honestly, the answer is I didn't experience anything in living that way that felt, somehow I can't do without it. I guess the overall sense of it was so strong in terms of what it offered to us, in terms of just that unmediated quality of being there, that, the hot water, whatever, nothing was really that big a deal. And on the other side, right now, if this computer disappeared this afternoon, I could live. It's not that big a deal. If the hot water goes, whatever. It's really not for me. I respect people. They are who they are. I know people, if they couldn't have a hair dryer, that's it. I was never like that. There are all these old ways of doing things, and they worked. People, goodness gracious, people lived a long time on Earth. They seemed to, be living. They didn't have all the things that we have, Our adaptability as human beings is clearly a two-edged sword. In one way, it's obviously part of our genius. In another way, it's not good at all, because we adapt to all these things, and then we say we have to have them. I just wrote an essay that was published a week or 2 ago about cobalt mining in the Congo. Cobalt's in every smartphone on the planet. The people who are doing that mining are just virtual slaves who are being worked to death. We don't need those phones. They didn't exist. We don't need them. But, we all want them. So that's a good example of a want that seems to be a need to people. So.
Right. Well, it's making me think that we feel like we need them. We think that we need them because it's like the majority of people, because we perceive that I'm using air quotes, most of the world and the people around us do have phones, and a lot of systems do rely on these phones. So in order to participate, in a way, if you define it that way, in order to participate in that system, we kind of do need them. And then it's a choice of participation. And if you don't participate, then where does that leave you? So it's a very interesting question, the want versus need. And I think that where we draw that line personally and collectively is really interesting and also really difficult.
I have a real personal example of exactly what you're saying. We've been out here in a rural area for the last 10 years. It's not that far removed. I mean, we're only 24 miles from the White House in Washington, D.C. So it's not like we're remote rural Maine or anything like that. We've never had real internet until about 2 months ago. There was a federal grant that finally brought us fiber optic internet. And this was an incredible boon to what I do, podcasting and our business, which is largely online. So those years, it felt like such a struggle to us. I had to go other places when we needed to record something. I was always having to go down into Washington, D.C. to Emma's house when I needed dependable internet. And I whined and complained about it a lot, admittedly. But in the end, I always thought there was this kind of underlying joke about the whole thing because, when I was growing up, the internet was what? Nobody ever heard of it. It wasn't a word. If someone had said, this is the way things are going to be in 30 years, we would have called that science fiction. And you speak of the adaptability of humans. It's like we adapt so quickly when it makes things so-called easier for us and is so, creates so-called solutions to things that we see as hardships. And then we create entire systems around them. We create entire economies around them, like the internet, for instance. And then you take that away, and then we feel like we have no framework. So what you experienced out there in the woods was you were taken back to the original framework of just living day to day with nature and the gifts of nature. So I think that's really profound, and it's just really something to think about. And also, as we've already said, it just wasn't that long ago at all that everybody lived this way. So I'm very curious. During your time of living and raising a family out there, you had one child when you moved there, and your son was born there in the house. And so you were raising them, and I understand they went to school during the day when they got of age, and you drove to a job. Did you ever feel like your children were missing anything, or there was anything that they weren't being prepared for by living that way or growing up that way?
It's obviously a very particular experience. And so it's not comparable to whatever you think of as the standard experience. I'm a writer. My wife's a painter. I was a librarian. So books were always a huge part of our household. We had a piano in that house. We also had a boombox connected to a car battery. We could listen to Bruce Springsteen in that house. So we didn't obviously have TV, but, we've never had TV, even when we have electricity. I'm not very interested in television. So we had a radio, listened to the Red Sox on the radio. So it wasn't that extreme. I think the whole techno thing has become much more extreme with the phones and the internet in the last 30 years. It just wasn't like that. Obviously, when you grow up that way, there's a degree of, isolation that you experience. But, on the other hand, that offers you something in terms of being able to be by yourself and not be terrified of being lonely in the way a lot of people are terrified of being lonely. And they're terrified if they're not connected. If you say to someone you have to go out in the woods and live for a day or two, to a lot of people, you might as well push them out of a 12-story window. That's not what they're looking to do in this world. So I don't really think that was really an issue in terms of, what was missing along those lines.
Did they go to school and they come back, and would they say, well, the other kids have this or that or live this way? Would they register any discontent or impatience with the lifestyle? Or what was their reaction to being around other children that lived a very different way?
Well, yeah, that's true. But again, it was rural Maine. So we're not talking, an upscale part of the world. It was rural Maine. Basically, that part of Maine is the northern tip of Appalachia. It runs up into Maine there. So, we had a car and it was a better car than some people had, honestly. So it wasn't like that, honestly. There were there are a couple other families in our town where they lived off the grid. We weren't the only people. I mean, I imagine at that point in time, most rural small towns in Maine had at least one or two families living off the grid. It was I knew people who lived in places that made our place seem like we were living on a highway, in terms of, trekking through the woods to get to their place. So it wasn't that big a deal that way.
So your children didn't experience that much contrast when they went to school or around other children. To them, it was just part of the spectrum that they saw all around them.
Yeah, absolutely.
I see. Okay, that's wonderful.
This is kind of going to be a vague, broad question, but do you have any stories you can tell us about, like a specific story, whether it's something that was really joyous and funny or something that was really hard and challenging that can sort of paint a picture of what life might have been like?
Well, sort of the foundational story of the whole thing, which I, write about in The Road Washes Out in Spring, is how we built the house, which was, we just didn't know a thing. We believed as college-educated people, we could read a book and it would tell us what to do. We were extremely short on practical experience. We knew what a hammer and a saw was. That's about it. So, but nonetheless, we resolved to do this, and we read books, and we ordered a sort of log cabin kit kind of house. And we were up there pouring cement for the piers for the house, and this guy showed up who would live down the road, whom I call Caleb in the book. He just kind of looked around and, said, looks like he had that understated Maine humor, like, looks like you're building something here. And indeed, we were. And it rained a lot that June when we started the house. So the road was just awful. It wasn't good to begin with. It got worse. And, we had these holes dug, and they immediately filled up with water. There were frogs leaping around all over the place. They were having a great time. This guy said, it's nice you're building this house. You think you'd like some help? And my wife and I looked at each other, for 5 seconds and said, yeah, we would like some help. And I said, well, I'm a carpenter. I'm a builder. I live around the corner. I could help you do this. So we talked some about what we were doing, and we shook hands, and that's how the house got built. Obviously, it was a relatively simple house, but we never talked money, which is pretty amazing. We had taken out an extremely modest mortgage to build the house, but we never talked money. And when he came up there the first day, and he showed up, literally 6:30 in the morning, because he got up, ate a bowl of oatmeal. He had a huge clan, a huge family. So a couple of his, it must have been, one was an in-law, one was a nephew, one was a grandson. One was a crackerjack carpenter. They helped him build the house. It was a complicated house. And he wasn't the world's, he wasn't a finished carpenter. As I quote him in the book, he used to say, close enough, spike it. He never worried about a 1/16 of an inch or anything like that. And that was fine. The house got built just fine. That's kind of the foundational story that sort of set the tone. So we sort of lived under the aura, so to speak, of people like Caleb, who was a really good-hearted person and extremely hardworking. And my wife and I were hardworking. And so people we were around who, even though we were strange in terms of what we did and who we were, coming from away, as they say, they respected work. And clearly we worked. We worked plenty. As I said, we never resented the work, but we worked, to take care of ourselves. People respected that. That would be a story of our being there.
I also enjoyed some of the stories, the different neighbors you had and your interactions with them and personalities involved and the type of people that existed in this type of world. And so could you speak to some of your neighbors?
Well, yeah, our immediate neighbors, Stanton and Ella, as I call them in the book, they lived in that farmhouse once Ella married Stanton, for whatever, over a half century, well over. Stanton that's where he grew up. And he was born around the turn of the 20th century. So really, in many ways, they were from the 19th century in terms of who they were and what their values were. Stanton farmed and then had to give it up because basically all the improvements after World War II to dairy farming put him out of business. He went to work at a sawmill. So they were truly old New England. They were very private people. They were not emotionally forthcoming, to put it mildly, but they were really good. They were good people. They were upright. They were decent people. They could be plenty censorious. They had no problem doing that. But, again, they were very hardworking, and they were really wholesome in a way in terms of this whole economy of taking care of yourself. That's who they were. The wife, Ella, grew, I want to say hundreds of gladiolas, okay? So she loved flowers. She loved glads. That was the delight of her life. Also hollyhocks out in front of the house. She would have a couple old tires out. She'd put a pot in and plant geraniums in them. She had geraniums growing in Maxwell House coffee cans. So there were all these touches of what we would call beauty about their place. It was extremely modest. They didn't have much money. What I said about, money in rural Maine is very real. But, that was their world. They were very attuned to it. They showed you the good side of it and the hard side of it, because it could be isolating. You could be provincial. You could sort of turn the world off at large. Narrow, the way you could be narrow in rural circumstances. So that was part of it. We were never inclined to romanticize the whole thing, who they were. But we also were appreciative of who they were as people. And they did sort of offer a window into what I think this country once was in terms of its rural character and the people who lived there, the people who were, when this country was rural more in the 19th century, who were the backbone of the country. So their fate, which obviously most of them, most people who homesteaded, I don't know what the statistic is, but most homesteads failed, often in desperate situations. People committing suicide, families breaking up, hard things. And both our neighbors' sons, they didn't live there. They moved away. They didn't want to live there.
Well, I thought so much about what Wendell Berry writes about, the disappearance of this type of life across America. You were seeing the taillights of that in your time out there, and the people that had been there and were going to, they were going to pass on. Yeah. And the culture was going to move on to whatever was next. So it's just really, really fascinating observations about the people that you were around and the relationship with money, the relationship with the neighbors. You point out that it wasn't necessarily all warm and fuzzy either.
No, it wasn't. Terrible things happened. I write about it in the book in our little town. Just awful, awful violence in there. All these things that you know about, domestic abuse, that was there.
So much for the romanticizing of it. But at the same time, your portrayal of just the beauty and the poetry of the ordinary day-to-day life. I want to read a quote from the book that really struck out to me. I read the book with a pencil in my hand because there were so many things I needed to underline. It was amazing. And it was very slow going, let me tell you, because I kept reading over things. But it was like reading an extended poem, and you are a poet, so it does make sense. But here's the quote. The ordinary was, of course, hardly ordinary. Who could imagine in his or her head even a fraction of what any acre of any woods or field held? So I just love that so much.
Thank you. And that's really the heart of an extremely large matter. Honestly, Owen basically describes the human race by and large at this point in time as ecological illiterates. And unfortunately, that's true. And, we're paying what looks like a catastrophic price for that illiteracy. I mean, if I could remake any school curriculum, the first thing would be the earth, and everything would connect to the earth that got taught. Everything. What is the foundation for all this? Obviously the earth. And obviously there's so much that we don't have any idea what is going on. The way, E.O. Wilson said, what we need are just endless number of natural scientists out there to help us understand what is going on the earth. So yeah, it's true, I think.
Owen's one of them. Owen's one of the natural scientists that are showing people the necessity and also the accessibility of letting these things be restored, or at least leaving the opportunity open for them to be restored. I'm doing a lot of it here in my own space and on my own property. And given the guidance that I've gotten from Owen, from talking to Owen and some other people that are doing similar things, it's very exciting to me. Okay, I want to read another quote. And this pertains to what we were talking about. The tasks of every day are so different from whatever people that live in the modern world, and they have all their water and heat and electricity and all those things are provided by them. So what are they doing? And while you guys are in the woods, creating all those things for yourself for your day-to-day sustenance. So here's the quote. Now people strove to justify their existence on their own, as if the energy of mental and physical efforts could provide metaphysical solace. I am busy, therefore I exist. I think that's so interesting because for the most part, most of us who are fortunate enough, we have access to food. We have access to all these things. So what do we do with ourselves? We get busy because we want to prove that we exist. So that's the way I understood that.
I agree. I mean, that's the all-purpose answer. When you ask people about what they're up to, they say they're busy. Okay. What are you busy about? What are you busy doing? This world doesn't ask us to be busy. I mean, it's funny with Owen's Gardens because you don't have to be busy. Nature knows what she's doing. She's been around longer than you have. I tell my writing students, the world is bigger than your head. You might not believe me, but, try to go with it. So we substitute all this, essentially random energy, to justify our being here. And our being here isn't not about justification. That's not what it's about. So I'm happy you focused on that because it's a pretty big issue for human beings.
Yeah, I wanted to hear about what it was like to come back on grid after that time. And at what point did you do that, I guess?
Yeah, well, of course, I went to work. I was a librarian, but that meant I dealt with a lot of AV stuff. So I dealt with cameras and, computers when they were coming in. And my wife was a nurse for many years, worked in a hospital setting. So it's not like we were primitive in that way. In terms of reentry, I guess there are two things. One's kind of funny. We didn't have anything that everybody has. So, we bought a house in a town. We didn't have anything. So we went to Sears. And we bought a washing machine, we bought a dryer, we bought a refrigerator. And the guy in the appliances department I thought he was just going to die of joy, because we just walked around and said, we'll take one of these, we'll take one of these. So finally, at the end, he said, this is a true story. He said, if you buy one more thing, I get a bonus. So I think we bought a vacuum cleaner or something, that we didn't have.
You made his day.
It was really funny. We made his day. And, someone said like an anthropologist should have followed us around that day in Sears, like we were just kind of gawking, asking all these questions like, what? I guess the main thing, honestly, is hot water is pretty nifty, even more than light. It's very handy. So that was kind of, whatever you want to call it, pleasure, having hot water. But otherwise, as I say, we had music, we had books, we had each other. I mean, that's a huge part of all this, honestly. I just don't think we mean as much to each other anymore as human beings, honestly. I think the machines have imposed themselves between all of us. So as much as we talk about being connected, I honestly feel there's a way people needed each other more and wanted to be with each other in ways more than we're not like that now. And obviously what we went through with the virus all over the planet, I think has made that even, whatever you want to call it, worse. I guess that's what I'd say about so-called reentry. But I have to say, it's not like we were all excited. It was just, this is how the world lives. So, okay. We can do it too. After all, we did do it when we were first married.
Did you just reach a point where it just felt like your life in the woods had just come to a natural conclusion or?
No, but it was a natural conclusion. Part of it was that clearly the old people were dying off. That way of life that our sort of mentors gave us wasn't really there the way it was there when we first came to it. And it was just plain. It had sort of done what it could do for us. We were never attached to it. And I think you understand that for ideological reasons. We weren't out to impress people with our virtue. we weren't trying to impress people with our purity. That was never, ever what it was about. So consequently, it wasn't some kind of ideological decision to leave. We were still, our kids went off into their lives. My wife and I were still married. And we were the people we were in terms of what we cared about. We transferred that, so to speak, to wherever we've lived. We've moved 3 times since the woods. The basic thing is, even though, we live the way we live and I think you understand this very well, is you're on the earth, period. And whether you're in a city, a country, you're on the earth. I mean, that's what Owen's book is sort of reminding people. Hey, you're on the earth. You can do this. You got 2 feet. You can do this, of ground. And obviously all that's going on, it's a planet. It's not, all the possessiveness makes us, all crazy that way. Because this is my lot and that's your lot. And this is your house and my house. This is my country. This is your country. Well, obviously the earth, that's not what the earth's about. There's no wall between Canada and the United States to stop the smoke. As much as some people are enamored of walls out there. So far, we don't really quite get that. Or, so-called civilized people do. Obviously, so-called native people have gotten that for thousands of years on the planet, but they have been obviously pushed aside by the forces of so-called progress.
So, wow, you just answered the whole next question I was going to ask. You got it all in there, but I do want to ask you, where do you see hope that we'll be able to shift the paradigm here?
That's not who I am, honestly. I'm not about hope. I believe it's really wonderful to be here every second you're here in terms of being on Earth. And that's it. I don't think there are any promises made to the human race. As far as I can tell, the human race has never particularly known what to do with itself. All you have to do is pick up the paper and it shows you pretty much, So that's the way it is. And there are all these great things. There's still spring and dogs and flowers and, all these wonderful things. That seems to me sufficient, honestly, in terms of being grateful and enjoying it. I mean, someone told me a story recently, someone in her 90s, and she pretty much couldn't see, couldn't hear. And this guy was taking care of her, said, "How do you feel today?" And she said, "I feel magnificent. I'm breathing." There's a lot to that, to put it mildly. So, I have to take pains with this too, because if you say that to a lot of people, they feel you're automatically a curmudgeon. I'm not a curmudgeon. I mean, poetry is about the thrill of being. That's what it's about. A flower or a bird doesn't have to go do anything. It's a flower or a bird or whatever it is, a work of art, whatever, a piece of music. It is what it is. I think that's a beautiful, beautiful part of life, You think someone has beautiful blue eyes. I mean, that's something very real right there. So all this, this notion of hope. And the flip side is then it tends to make us dishonest, honestly. Now, we don't want to look anything in the face because we have, quotes, hope. It seems the least we could try to do is be honest, particularly since a lot of other life depends on us, in terms of the creatures and the plants and all that's on Earth. Let's try to live on Earth. If we were honest, then that would seem to me to be an important value, as opposed to walking around with our heads full of something called hope. So that's my 2 cents about it.
That's pretty cool.
It is. I would like to say that you offer hope to me personally by seeing poetry and everything. And you also shine an honest light on the world as it is. And to me personally, that is hopeful. Yeah. So I hope that's okay with you, that I see hope in your poems.
Far be it from me to be authoritarian about that. So, yeah.
Well, I think if more people could look through that lens of this is the world around us, this is the way it is, and then they can fall in love. They can fall in love with the world and the earth. It's been said on here many times before. When you love something, you take care of it.
That's deeply true. Deeply true.
So this might sound redundant, Baron, but we talk a lot about slow living on this podcast, and part of our mission is to help inspire others to explore slow living and figure out what that means to them. And so I guess I want to ask you, what does slow living mean to you, and how do you find slow living in your everyday?
I think it's what Mary was just talking about. It's about taking the time to care. If you're going to do something, whatever it is, it's about trying to take the time to care. And pretty much every day is filled with all kinds of occasions for us to slow down and care about whatever it is that we're doing. I mean, we haven't even talked today about food, really, particularly, and cooking, which has been at the heart of the life that my wife and I have led, whether we're off the grid or on the grid. And the care that goes into raising food, taking care of food, cooking food. To me, that all wants to be slow. Well, I mean, after all, no food, no anything. We're creatures of appetite, for better and for worse. So the more we slow down and respect that, respect that caring, to me, the fuller our lives become, as far as just being here and taking in all the miraculous quality of that we get to experience by being in this world. So that's what I would say about slow living.
Thank you. Yes, slow food is certainly an integral part of slow living, and that's a whole topic that we love to embrace here as well. The next question also overlaps with that, and it's something we ask all of our guests. What does the good dirt mean to you? And of course, you can answer that literally or metaphorically or any way that comes to mind.
Well, Robert Frost wrote about build soil. And that clearly is, again, one of the crucial human enterprises, has been for thousands of years, is to build soil. And, obviously Wendell Berry's written about this eloquently, as have others. That's a central value. Good dirt is a central value. And that wants to be respected, ideally, by everyone. Again, no dirt, no anything. And so building soil in whatever ways we could do that. I mean, I have friends in New York City who grow, basil, whatever herbs on a fire escape. They're building a little soil there in their way. They're participating. That clearly should be part of every child's education, is to learn about building soil. That's just way more important than technology, because it's ancient, and we don't have anything without the soil. So good dirt is, it's a great phrase, because it's real. It's real.
And you don't have to move off grid or move to a farm or own 100 acres or any acres to have a relationship with it.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
What do you think that through your writing and our time here together, what would you like people to most understand about your work and your message in the world?
It's tried to be all of a piece in terms of, what I talk about poetry and the thrill of being, and to me, the gratitude. It's wonderful. Those books behind me, it's wonderful that there is poetry. It's existed for thousands of years. It's another thing that should be in the heart of every school. It's not. That's really my message. It's not, as I said, it's not about virtue or goodness or anything like that. I'm just another person. But I think there's a great deal to that, because it does simplify in ways that make sense, basically. And we all want to make sense of being in this world. The more we can root that in actualities like poetry, song, dirt, food, whatever, I have to believe the better off we are.
Thank you so much, Baron. I've enjoyed this conversation so much, and it has really filled me up.
Yeah, it's been so lovely to talk to you.
You're reading your book the road washes out in spring has been like a meditation for me. And I really appreciate it. And I'm grateful for your work in the world, and I'm grateful for your voice, grateful for your experience, and grateful that you brought Owen into the world to bring the next generation into more consciousness and intentionality about their relationship with the land as well. So many, many thanks.
Well, you're welcome. It's been my pleasure to meet you two today. It's very heartening to learn about what you're up to. I appreciate it. So you're welcome, and thanks for you being who you are.
Thanks. Thank you for tuning in, calling in, and spreading the good dirt. We love hearing from you. You can reach our listener voicemail at 443-459-1950. That's 443-459-1950. You can find this number in our show notes and in our Instagram profile.
This show is produced by Lady Farmer, a slow living lifestyle community, and the original music is composed and performed by John Kingsley.
For more from Lady Farmer, follow us on Instagram at WeAreLadyFarmer. That's WeAreLadyFarmer. Or join us online at www.ladyfarmer.com. We'll see you next time on The Good Dirt.
Goodbye.